Hi, welcome to my Azure Vault's Mythic Dungeon Guide. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in a Azure Vault run. The Azure Vault is a tricky dungeon, and may be more prone to mistakes than other dungeons, so keep your guard up for this one. I'll be making a dungeon guide for all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 1, so be sure to subscribe if you want to catch those. Just like with my Shadowlands guides, I'll be marking important or impactful mob abilities in red, and less important abilities in green. Additionally, I will be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleeds for Drakthayers, and poisons or diseases. Let's start. So let's get some of the dungeon mechanics out of the way. The dungeon has an alarm mechanic. There are whelps on patrol, and guard these halls from intruders. Should they be alarmed to your presence, they will immediately call for backup, activating the nearby petrified guards. These guards are sufficiently difficult, and despite the fact that they give count, they should be avoided at all costs. When you enter the dungeon, you will pick up a few treants and bring them over to the room away from the whelpling. In this pack, you face 2 unique mobs. The first is a Conjured Lasher. While they don't seem dangerous, they can be dangerous in large numbers. They occasionally cast Mystic Vapors, dealing damage and applying a dot to all nearby players. This dot stacks, and when all Lashers cast this at the same time, it can be quite dangerous. If you have a priest, they should mass dispel this if the stacks go higher than 3. You will also face an Arcane Tender, and you will face them again later on. Their first ability is Infused Ground, where they shoot 3 bolts at 3 random players. Upon landing at the player's position, leaves behind a pool that does fair damage. So tanks, try to move the adds out of these pools. Their other ability is Erratic Growth, where they channel a debuff on a player. Should they successfully complete this cast, that player will be stunned, turned into a tree for 6 seconds. At the end of those 6 seconds, or upon dispelling, any players within 5 yards of that player will also be turned into a tree, potentially causing a chain reaction of infinite tree transformation. This is a priority interrupt. But should the interrupt be missed, be sure to move away from the tree so that the player can be dispelled. While it's not optimal to pull the petrified mobs, there's a high chance you may face them in a few of your runs, so I'll be describing them before the first boss. You do face these mobs again later on in the dungeon, so I don't recommend skipping this. Crystal Thrashers are the first and largest among the petrified mobs. Their first ability is Splintering Shard, where they throw shards at 3 random players. It'll deal some damage and apply a dot. Their other ability is Crystalline Rupture, where they stomp the ground, dealing lethal damage to enemies within 15 yards after a few seconds. You'll want to walk out of this. The other mob, and considerably more dangerous, is the Crystal Fury. They are dangerous because of their ability Piercing Shard. This is where they throw shards at all players in a frontal cone, dealing quite a bit of damage and applying a heavy dot. This means that the tank faces them towards the party, that's a lot of damage to heal through. It is very important not to face them to the party, as this insane amount of damage will often lead to a wipe. They also cast Arcane Fury, granting them a 35% damage buff, further amplifying that dot damage. You'll want to dispel this. Mages can steal this buff for themselves. And that's all the unique mobs before the first boss. There will be 3 Arcane Lashers channeling on the boss, and you need to kill them before you can fight the boss. If you decide to pull multiple tenders together, keep a watch for interrupts and dispels, as pulling too many without coordination can be dangerous. And so you face your first boss, Leymor. This fight revolves around destroying the leyline sprouts the boss creates to avoid getting one-shot by their main ability. Throughout the fight, the boss will spawn several leyline sprouts around the room when the fight begins. The sprouts themselves deal damage to players within a small AoE around them, so be sure to avoid them. The first way to destroy the sprouts is through the frontal ability Erupting Fissure. This is directed at the tank and destroys any caught in its path. Tanks face this away from the team and try to destroy as many sprouts as possible. The other way is through the ability Explosive Brand, where they slam the ground, dealing significant damage to any player within 6 yards, and knocks all players back. This immediately places a large AoE around each player, and after 6 seconds the AoE will explode, destroying all sprouts caught in their large radius. This is the primary way to destroy sprouts. Destroying sprouts with either of these techniques will cause a small volatile sapling to spawn. This sapling doesn't do much, only casting Sappy Burst, exploding in a small AoE upon death. Just be careful with aggro here, as they spawn all around the room and tanks may have difficulty immediately grabbing all of them. Throughout the fight, the boss will place a dot on the tank that deals continuous damage through Infused Strike. It can be painful, so healers, keep your tanks topped up. And finally, the boss's last ability is called Consuming Stomp. This deals damage to the entire party and destroys all leyline sprouts still remaining. For each sprout destroyed this way, the Stomp does 20% more damage. Generally, it isn't too difficult to destroy all the sprouts before each Stomp, so play it well and this boss should be quite easy. We then make our way to the next area, where you face another set of guard whelps. These ones are not too hard to dodge, so just move out of the way. Moving past them and the petrified guards, you face 2 arcane elementals. You'll face several of them in the packs ahead. Pulling too many at a time can be dangerous because of their ability Waking Bane, sleeping a random party member for 8 seconds. While this can be dispelled, your healer only has 1 dispel on an 8-second cooldown, so you'll want to interrupt this when you can. They also cast Arcane Bolt at the tank, which is not quite as important to interrupt. Moving past those elementals, you face a set of platforms. These platforms are littered by rune traps. If you don't move out of them in time, you'll be polymorphed for 20 seconds. You probably don't want that to happen to you. On the platforms, you are also continuously affected by arcane powers flowing in the air. There are quite a few of them, so I'll leave you to explore them yourselves. They don't usually drastically affect you, though one does have an AoE that buffs allies and enemies with haste, so just don't overlap that with enemies if you can. To move past this first circular platform, you'll need to defeat all the mobs on it. However, should you be able to make your trash count elsewhere in the dungeon, you can do a sneaky skip through Priest's ability Levitate, slowly gliding down to the next platform, skipping not one platform but both entirely. I don't see why this couldn't work with Mage's Slow Fall, but you'll need to test it out for yourself. Should you not want to or be unable to do this, I'll describe all the mobs here. Turning left, you face 2 arcane elementals and an unstable curator. The curator casts Heavy Tome, dealing significant damage to the tank. Interrupt this if possible, though you might want to save interrupt for Waking Bane from the elementals. Their other ability is Forbidden Knowledge, continuously peppering the field in arcane explosions for 4 seconds. Getting hit by any of these deals significant damage to you and disorients you. This is particularly dangerous for the tank, as getting disoriented drops all aggro for the duration of the disorient. As for the other mobs, be careful of the nearby patrols, as they could potentially overwhelm you while you're pulling other packs. We've seen all other mobs on this platform with the exception of one, the Rune Seal Keeper, and you'll see more of them later on. This mob has a couple of abilities. The first is Condensed Frost, dealing damage to the tank. It is interruptible, but their second ability is much more important to interrupt. It's called Icy Bindings. This roots all players for 5 seconds and deals damage over that duration. This root may cause other mob abilities to damage you unavoidably, so please interrupt this. It is dispellable, so if you happen to miss it, Priest can mass dispel it. Just because it's extremely dangerous, I have to emphasize to tanks, you must face the Crystal Furies away from the party. The damage from their frontal is significant and will lead to wipes. After clearing the platform, books will appear on the inner part of the ring. Interact with them to go downstairs. Down here, there's only one new mob, the Arcane Constructs. The Arcane Constructs aren't very threatening. Their first ability is Arcane Bash, swiping in a conal front, dealing damage and knocking players back. They also have Conjured Barrier, which is a dispellable magic shield. This cannot be interrupted. Generally, for the platforms, tanks just face the mobs away from the party, and it should be easygoing. You may also face another mob, probably not, but it does patrol. It's called the Astral Attendant. They only cast Unstable Power, throwing out several bombs around the area. Just don't stand in swirlies. After clearing what you need to, you cross the gap with another book, and you're almost at the second boss. All around the room are familiar faces. Seal Keepers that cast Icy Bindings, you need to kick. Astral Attendants that cast Unstable Power, watch your feet. And 2 new mobs. The first of which is Vault Guards. They only really have one ability, Ice Cutter, dealing significant damage to the tank. They also have Brilliant Scales, granting them a 30% protection from magic damage. It has no cast time, so the only thing you can do against them is dispel them. The other mob is a mini-boss, the Scalebane Lieutenant. It is identical to the Vault Guards. They have Ice Cutter and Brilliant Scales. But they also have 2 new abilities. The first and most noticeable is the Mage Hunter's Fervor. They have an aura that grants them and all nearby allies a 25% damage buff. They also have Spellfrost Breath. It's a Dragon Breath frontal. Try to face it away from the group tanks, and everyone else just avoid it. Mechanically, the Lieutenant isn't particularly dangerous, but they amplify the damage of all other enemies, so pull with caution. After clearing out most of the room, you fight the second boss, Azureblade. This boss fight is very intensive on the healer, so use defensives appropriately. The boss starts the fight by spawning a draconic image. This image continuously casts Illusionary Bolt, dealing direct damage to a random player. You'll want to interrupt this, as there really is nothing else to interrupt in this fight. Upon death, they launch projectiles all around the room that explode in an AoE. The boss doesn't do anything else otherwise though. They have a Cleave through Arcane Cleave, just face that away from the party. They cast Ancient Orb, throwing out a large orb in a direction after a long cast. It is very slow, so dodging this should be trivial. However, when the boss runs out of energy, they run to the center of the room and begin casting Overwhelming Energy. This spawns 4 adds, and the boss begins to pulse, dealing continuous damage to all players for the rest of the cast. At the same time, Ancient Orb fragments will continuously shoot out of the boss in 4 directions. A lot to dodge and a lot to heal. The Draconic Illusions don't do anything, but they keep the boss in this phase. To exit this high damage phase, you'll need to defeat the 4 illusions. Past that, the whole fight is relatively easy. Then you begin the long walk to the third boss. There are only 3 more unique mobs for the rest of the dungeon. There are quite a few of them though, and the first you will encounter is the Draconid Breaker. The Breaker has 2 abilities that cannot be interrupted. The first is a Shoulder Slam. Upon completion of a 2-second cast, they charge at a random targeted player. While not dangerous, it can push you into other mobs, traps, or even later on off the edge, so be careful. Their other ability is an unavoidable group damage ability called Bestial Roar. The next mob you find here is the Tarasek Delver. The Delver doesn't seem very threatening, as they only cast Tear Flesh on their current target, the tank. This is a bleed and it stacks. If you pull many of these guys at the same time, and they all use it on the tank at the same time, that is a lot of damage. Evokers with their bleed dispels can work wonders here. And finally, is the Null Magic Hornswogg. The Hornswogg is quite harmless, occasionally jumping to a random player. This deals damage to that player and dispels all buff off that player, so be sure not to greedily cast your abilities in swirlies. While not dangerous, this can make it take a while to kill these Hornswoggs. And that's it for the dungeon trash. And now we make our way to the third boss, Telash Greywing. Greywing only has 3 mechanics. The first and most important is Frostbomb. It places a small AoE around all players that deals some damage, and at the end of its duration drops a pool below all players. The size of the pool is slightly larger than the size of the AoE, and grows slightly after dropping. This slows and deals a fair amount of damage. Move out of these immediately. You will want to move this to one side and prepare room for movement. Do not corner yourself or your party. The boss then casts Icy Devastator, channeling a beam at a player, dealing damage to that player and any other players within 8 yards. Isolate yourself and keep DPSing this boss. It is a race. Finally, and most importantly, is Absolute Zero. At 100 energy, the boss moves to the center of the room and begins to channel Absolute Zero. During this cast, they will be 99% immune to damage, and at the end of the cast they explode, dealing significant lethal damage to all players. To avoid getting obliterated by this damage, you'll want to step on one of 3 of the runes around the room. All players will want to stand on the same rune, as using the rune consumes it, permanently disabling the rune from future Absolute Zeros. Defeating this boss is definitely a race. How long do you have until you run out of room or consume all the runes? Try to synchronize movements around the ring, and absolutely do not place the pools on the runes. Upon defeating Greywing, you interact with the book and are already at the last boss, no more trash. The arena is large, but you will want to keep movement to a minimum. While moving, players build up stacks of Oppressive Miasma, slowing players for 7% for 10 seconds. This stacks up to 10, for a 70% slow. As for the boss themselves, they cast Dragon Strike, applying a magic debuff to the tank. It does a fair amount of damage, so healers should dispel this as soon as they can. The boss's second ability is Crystalline Roar. They turn to a random party member and begin to charge a frontal in that direction. Move out of this. If you have multiple miasma stacks, you may find difficulty in getting out of the way. Healers should try to dispel the target if possible. The boss occasionally casts Arcane Eruption, spawning vortexes around the arena. Standing in these vortexes when they spawn deals lethal damage to you and knocks you back. These vortexes then spawn an orb that moves around the arena following players. The orbs seemingly move towards players with 10 stacks of miasma, so watch your stacks of miasma. The boss also infrequently casts Unleash Destruction, pushing all players back slightly and dealing unavoidable damage. And finally, the boss's last ability is Brittle. At 75, 50, and 25% health, the boss will launch 5 crystals around the room, 4 detonating crystals and 1 hardened crystal. Each of them will begin to cast Fracture. Should any of these crystals complete this cast, they will explode, dealing damage and applying a dot to all players. That stacks. It is a priority to kill them before they finish this cast. The hardened crystal in particular has a large shield. In higher keys, when you don't have the DPS or time to kill them all before they finish the cast, it is likely that you will need to let the hardened crystal go off and kill every other crystal. And that's the whole fight. And that's Azure Vault. There aren't too many unique mobs, so it's one of the more mechanically simple dungeons in Dragonflight. I make these videos to give players a full overview of dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next dungeon guide.